Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 1 June 2025. It is the 118th anniversary of the birth of Jan Patočka, who was born in Turnov, Bohemia, on this date in 1907. Patočka signed the Charter 77 document, named for the year in which it appeared, which called for the Czech communist government to respect the human rights accords to which it was a signatory. The communist government reacted badly to this initiative, mobilizing its secret police to harass the signers of Charter 77. Patočka became a spokesman for the charter, and as a spokesman for Charter 77, Patočka was taken in for questioning by the Czech regime's secret police, dying a few days after his interrogation at the age of 69. Patočka had already been banned from teaching except for a brief period from 1968 to 1972. He gave lectures for what was called the Underground University, which was an attempt to put into practice what Václav Havel had called the parallel polis, a parallel infrastructure intended as an alternative to the corrupt public institutions of officialdom. Few of Patočka's works were published in his country during his lifetime. His books were circulated in manuscript among his students, so he was, in a sense, a samizdat philosopher. Patočka was influenced by phenomenology and wrote an introduction to Husserl's phenomenology. Like J. Glenn Gray, whom I discussed in my previous episode, Patočka was influenced by Heidegger and Hannah Arendt, so his phenomenology veers off in an existential direction. His first book, The Natural World as a Philosophical Problem, of 1936, pursues a similar direction to that of American philosopher Marvin Farber, who studied with Husserl and who also made an effort at rapprochement between phenomenology and naturalism. As a phenomenologist, Patočka's work on philosophy of history continues the development of several themes that we can find in Husserl. In several episodes, I've discussed Husserl and his influence in philosophy of history. For example, Voegelin reacted against Husserl, while others such as Ludwig Landgrebe and David Carr, like Patočka, carried on the phenomenological philosophy of history of Husserl. Patočka's major work on philosophy of history was his Heretical Essays in the Philosophy of History, which was, I think, only first published in Czech in 1990 and in English translation in 1996. And this consists of 6 essays. The first, Reflections on Prehistory. Second, The Beginning of History. Third, Does History Have a Meaning? Fourth, Europe and the European Heritage until the end of the 19th century. Fifth, Is Technological Civilization Decadent and Why? Sixth, Wars of the 20th Century and the 20th Century as War. And then these 6 essays are followed by what's called in the edition, in the English edition, an author's gloss. But this isn't the whole of Patočka's thought on history. There's also a collection of Patočka's papers, selected writing of Jan Patočka, Care for the Soul, which includes 5 papers on philosophy of history, 1 from 1935 and 4 from the 1970s. His early book on Husserl, while not focused on history, does take up historical themes near the end, as did Husserl himself at the end of his work. This is arguably the book that is most closely aligned with Husserl's conception of history, and in it we find Patočka writing the following, quote, "Even though the passivity of the natural world always remains the basis of all the conceptual arsenal, the fact is that in history there emerged, under certain circumstances, a new goal, a new idea, and with it a new possibility, the possibility of humans actually taking over their conceptual universe and accepting responsibility for it. That is, to subject all that its meaningful relations to radical testing. That is a new level of clarity and rationality, which does presuppose clarity, transparence already in the preceding world, though one that is not sufficient unto itself and calls for a further, deeper, specifically a universal clarity." unquote. This is very much in the spirit of Husserl's posthumously published The Crisis of European Sciences, one of the sources of which was a lecture he had prepared for Prague in 1935, but which he didn't ultimately deliver. The themes of universality, and humanity taking responsibility for itself are continuous from Husserl. University, rationality, and responsibility were the edifying themes that were the thrust of Husserl's vision for the future of humanity. But this aspirational vision stood out against a background of the crisis of European sciences, which, even as they pointed the way to greater things, were themselves beleaguered in the present. Husserl, late in his life, wrote in a manuscript that was included as an appendix to the Crisis of European Sciences, and he began in this manuscript, quote, "Philosophy as science, as serious, rigorous, indeed apodictically rigorous science, the dream is over," unquote. Is this an admission of defeat? Not exactly, at least I don't think it is, but it is an admission that philosophy needs to shift gears to get a handle on what's going on. In my episode on Glenn Gray, I talked about the pearl clutching over modernity that has characterized philosophy since the late 19th century. This was a theme that Nietzsche arguably introduced in philosophy when he warned about nihilism. Many philosophers who came to focus on crisis, as Husserl himself did, were similarly issuing a warning about nihilism, even if in different terms than those in which Nietzsche issued his warning. Patočka was part of this tradition, drawing more on Husserl and Heidegger than on Nietzsche, but still there's a continuity of interests among those who foresaw the disasters of the 20th century, like Nietzsche, and those who lived through them, like Patočka. In his later works, when Patočka is speaking more in his own voice, he doesn't abandon the aspirational Husserlian themes he embraced in his early work on phenomenology, but we could say that he preempts this line of thought by delving more deeply into history, trying to get out in front of it, or, if you like, behind it, depending on your perspective. Husserl had implied that there was a problem sometime in the early history of Western civilization that only came to a head much later in the crises that he discusses, but Husserl leaves the source of the problem ambiguous. Glenn Gray, following Heidegger, saw the whole of Western civilization converging on exploitation and destruction. Patočka takes up the theme of Western civilization that these other thinkers had grappled with and develops it in his own distinctive way, which he characterizes as a form of heresy. What was Patočka's historical heresy in his heretical essays on philosophy of history? In the English translation of Paul Ricoeur's preface to the French edition of the Heretical Essays in Philosophy of History, Ricoeur identifies it as such, quote, "The heresy lies precisely in the new definition of the natural world as the world of prehistory, which in turn is a consequence of the characterization of history as problematic," unquote. And Ricoeur calls this, quote, "a point of rupture not only with vulgar Marxism, that is too obvious, but more decisively and dramatically with the views of Husserl and Heidegger about history," unquote. It's somewhat unusual for philosophers of history to discuss prehistory, and I've tried to emphasize this in my episodes on those with a primarily naturalistic conception of history, as with Leonard Woolley, Hans Zinser, V. Gordon Childe, and others, who sought to expand history beyond its conventional scope, including prehistory, along with conventional history. Patočka begins his heretical essays with an essay on prehistory, but it's not a discussion of prehistory like you'd find in any naturalistic thinker, since he's coming from a background of phenomenology and transcendental philosophy. The natural world with which Patočka begins is the world as given to us in transcendental philosophy. The natural world, as it might be understood in analytical philosophy, he rejects as, quote, the artificial view of modern mechanistic metaphysics, unquote. Patočka shows us that he is at least aware of the views of analytical philosophy. For example, he cites Bertrand Russell's neutral monism, but that's not how he approaches what he calls the natural world as a philosophical problem. The naturalism of analytical philosophy, he says, quote, led to hypothetical constructs so complex that it was virtually impossible to recognize the natural world, unquote. He's not wrong, and this has repeatedly proved to be a stumbling block with and for analytical philosophy. What is natural for Patočka is, quote, the world of pure experience, of its components, and of the relations that bring such elements into contact with one another, and so on, unquote. And that, quote, in place of little islands of consciousness in a sea of first naturally, then natural scientifically conceived objectivity, we came to think of an ocean of intersubjectivity surrounding the continent of the objective world, which served to mediate between individual transcendental streams of experience, unquote. He discusses Husserl and Heidegger for most of his essay on prehistory, considering Husserl's Lebenswelt, or life world, and Heidegger on being, but he does eventually converge on prehistory by incrementally backing up from the present and reaching deeper into history. He cites Fustel de Coulanges on the patrician households of antiquity as the basis of the state in Greece and the Roman Republic. Then he backs up in time before classical antiquity, narrowly speaking, and discusses ancient mythology and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Finally, near the end of the essay on prehistory, he explicitly addresses prehistory. Quote, this tradition attests to a prehistorical world of which we can speak as natural in the sense just described. It is natural in the sense of accepting the community of all it contains as something simply given, something that simply manifests itself. It is a community of gods and mortals, the shared life space of those dependent on the nourishing earth and the heavenly lights of those who are not so dependent and who thus constitute the most wondrous mystery of this world. They are not dependent, yet their mode of being is such that a community with humans can be an advantage to them, since what humans do ultimately for the sake of their own survival, the Sisyphean toil in service of self-devouring life, is the work of the gods, a participation in preserving the world order, linking what is above with what is below, earth and the lights, the visibly created with the realm of darkness, unquote. Patočka's way to prehistory is very different from what we'd find in any straightforwardly naturalistic philosopher, but as I said earlier, Patočka, like Marvin Farber, attempted a synthesis of transcendental philosophy with naturalism, and the result is bound to look different from naturalism itself without the transcendental element in the mix. We could say that it's a quixotic quest to attempt to reconcile naturalism and transcendentalism, but this is what Patočka is doing, albeit in his own way. Patočka's theme is the transition from ahistorical peoples to history proper, and this transition is partly an historical process that can be described in naturalistic terms, but it's also a historical process that can be described in transcendental terms. After the 6 essays of the book, Patočka appended a kind of commentary on his own work called the Author's Gloss, and in his gloss he characterizes the transition from the prehistoric to the historic as follows, quote, prehistoric humanity is a transition. It is close on the one hand to non-historical life in the poverty of its living only to live. On the other hand, it anticipates the threshold of a new, deeper, but also more demanding and more tragic mode of living. Let us consider whether the threshold of living just to live is not crossed when prophets arise, risking their life for a religious rebirth, dedicating it to a life-absorbing asceticism, protesting against the powerful and the violent. There are prophets who with full insight work out a firm norm of the life, not for individuals as exceptions, but rather for entire extended communities. That is, a renewal of social life, which we would ordinarily, unhesitatingly identify as historical, unquote. I said earlier that Patočka's book, An Introduction to Husserl's Phenomenology, was the closest to Husserl's position in which he had expressed universal clarity as an ideal. Patočka eventually comes to question universalism as when he writes, quote, an existentially oriented phenomenology is marked not only by a subjective, that is, non-objective principle, but also by giving up any claim to universal validity, unquote. Before this, he had offered an explanation of how the former ideal of universality had become tainted. Quote, expanding Western Europe lacks any universal bond, any universal idea which could be embodied in a concrete and effective bonding institution and authority. The primacy of having over being excludes unity and universality, while the attempts to replace them with power prove vain, unquote. But universality, he argues, has taken on a new form. Quote, in science itself, in mathematics foremost, there is a spirit of technological domination emerging, a universality of a wholly different type than the ancient universality of content and modeling, a formalizing universality imperceptibly shifting to unemphasis on product over content, on mastery rather than understanding, unquote. We can compare this imperceptible shift from understanding to mastery as being part and parcel of the fall of universality from authentically bonding institutions to the mere exercise of power. Patočka's treatment of this makes it clear that something went wrong, but at the same time he recognized that new forces were released in history, especially in the form of technology. The technological manifestation of modernity, which I discussed in my episode on Glenn Gray, Heidegger and Gray largely rejected, while figures like Filippo Marinetti and Ernst Jünger embraced and celebrated as a new technological epoch of history. Patočka saw that Jünger had grasped something essential about industrialized warfare, and he wanted to recognize this for what it was rather than merely rejecting it without understanding this new force in history. Quote, war is simultaneously the greatest undertaking of industrial civilization, both product and instrument of total mobilization, as Ernst Jünger rightly saw, and the release of orgiastic potentials which could not afford such extreme of intoxication with destruction under any other circumstances. Already at the dawn of modernity, at the time of the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, that kind of cruelty and orgiasm emerged, unquote. In connection with this passage, Patočka cites Jünger's total mobilization essay, which I've previously mentioned as a significant influence on Heidegger. Patočka also cited Jünger's war as inner experience, and he doesn't flinch at Jünger's strongest formulation, to which he gives their full measure, you could say. On the First World War, Patočka writes, quote, the First World War is the decisive event in the history of the 20th century. It determined its entire character. It was this war that demonstrated that the transformation of the world into a laboratory for releasing reserves of energy accumulated over billions of years can be achieved only by means of wars. Thus, it represented a definitive breakthrough of the conception of being that was born in the 16th century with the rise of mechanical natural science, unquote. He even characterizes the front experience, which I mentioned in my episode on Glenn Gray, that Germans call the Fronterlebnis, that the front experience of soldiers during the First World War was a form of absolute freedom. Quote, this absolute freedom is the understanding that here something has already been achieved, something that is not the means to anything else, a stepping stone to, but rather something above and beyond which there can be nothing, unquote. So, as strange as it seems, Patočka is surprisingly close to Younger in seeing that a new order has been brought into being by industrialized warfare. And this, I think, is far more heretical than the heresy of prehistory that Paul Ricoeur identified. In his detour through the natural world as a philosophical problem and prehistory as a presupposition of history, even as Patočka moves away from explicitly Husserlian themes of rationality and universality, focusing more on openness and freedom, and even recognizing this openness and freedom in the orgiastic excesses of industrialized warfare, at the same time, he recurs to fundamental phenomenological themes. For example, he writes, quote, "The idea that history is the domain of acting in freedom and that freedom consists in grasping the possibility of letting things be what they are, letting them reveal themselves to present themselves in the willingness to be the ground of their manifestation, ready for the shaking of the familiar and given certainties so that what truly is can become manifest," unquote. This is a displacement of Husserl's call to look to the things themselves into the moral realm of human thought and human action. It is in freedom that things reveal themselves for what they are. In the previous quote, Patočka mentions the shaking of the familiar, and shaking was a metaphor that he came to use more broadly. For example, Patočka says, no, quote, "No sooner do humans confront the shaken world than they are not only grasped by its forces, but also mobilized for a new battle," unquote. He eventually came to see humanity as what he called the solidarity of the shaken. This emerges in the wake of the frontline experience, once known only to a few soldiers, which then becomes the condition of modern society lived by all. That is to say, the lived experience of combat that I discussed in relation to Glenn Gray becomes universalized as the human condition. The front line experience, Patočka says, is, quote, "the experience of all individuals projected individually each to their summit from which they cannot retreat back to everydayness, where they will inevitably be seized again by war," unquote. But we are delivered from this unsustainable intensity by the solidarity of the shaken. Quote, "The means by which this state is overcome is the solidarity of the shaken, the solidarity of those who are capable of understanding what life and death are all about, and so what history is about. That history is the conflict of mere life, barren and chained by fear, with life at the peak, life that does not plan for the ordinary days of the future, but sees clearly that the everyday, its life and its peace have an end," unquote. The themes of the shaken, of freedom, and of letting the things themselves reveal themselves all come together in the following passage from the author's gloss that I mentioned earlier. Quote, "The idea that history is the domain of acting in freedom and that freedom consists in grasping the possibility of letting things be what they are, letting them reveal themselves, to present themselves in the willingness to be the ground of their manifestation, ready for the shaking of the familiar and given certainties so that what truly is can become manifest," unquote. Happy birthday, Jan Patočka, and thanks for listening.